hope I don't say anything embarrassing. Not that, it's just weird, it's a weird feeling to be on camera. Brittany, can you see when I write over here? I mean, I know you can see. Can you see that because of this thing? Okay. Don't forget to do that. That won't be on screen. So, Selena, just so you know why there's a camera here, I have a student who's joining us online. And so today she has to do something related to school. So I'm filming this lecture. Normally she will actually be zooming in from my phone. So my phone will be out periodically. And she may or may not contribute to class, but she will be part of the class as best she can be. So, just so you understand why I'm doing this kind of crazy thing. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Maybe Thornwell somehow been scared away from the class somehow. Maybe he'll show up. But this is, Selena's added the class. This is Selena Sanders. Saunders. Avi, Brittany. Do y'all know each other?
Yeah, she's in my last.
Okay. Okay. So welcome. The first thing that I want y'all to do is to, you can do this on a sheet of paper, a regular sheet of paper, if you've got one that you can turn in, or this can be kind of a daily grade, if you will. So if you've got a sheet of paper, I would like for you to tell me what you think of when you think of a movie. Like if you're going to watch a movie, and then the movie is realistic. Somebody says, Brittany, you'll love this movie, it's realistic. What are some qualities? You can just make a list of qualities. If you heard that a movie was going to be realistic, that's okay. We're doing a kind of in-class writing, and I'll take this up for grade. So just it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be a full paragraph, or it can be just a list. So if somebody was telling you they're going to show you a movie, and the movie was going to be realistic, what would be some qualities of a realistic movie? So you can just list what some of those qualities are. I'm just going to try to get to the idea of what we mean when we say something is realistic, or that literature's realism might be. And while you're doing that, I'm going to write some terms up here. do with that? What are some things that make a movie realistic? If you said, so it's really realistic movie, what's the detail or what's the specific about it that lets you know it's realistic?
It's having on proper emotions.
Okay, so the emotions seem proper, that's an interesting term there, to the situation. So if somebody should be angry, the acting, so this is kind of like good acting, right? Like if something, you're supposed to be scared, people look scared. If you're supposed to be sad, people really look like they're sad, right? So this is probably good acting, but it's also, nobody is overdoing it, right? It's what it should be, what you think it should be. Yeah, Rick?
Right, when I think of like movies that like kind of like how like a character has to like really make it or something. Like if it's drama, if it's realistic, you know, it gets kind of nitty gritty.
Okay, so I'm gonna say detail for that. So there's detail that shows it's kind of a real situation. So I'll give you, this is a kind of a grotesque example that involves vomiting. But I watched this really cool movie over the weekend about the lockdown in London with Anne Hathaway and Chiwetel Ejiofor. And he had been a former heroin addict. It's kind of a side story. And he inexplicably finds these opium bulbs in his garden. And because it's lockdown and pandemic and he and his girlfriend are not getting along, he eats some. And the next morning he shows him throwing up. He goes, I don't know why I thought I could eat opium after 10 years and it not make me sick. That throwing up was a vivid, grotesque detail that I didn't necessarily need to see, but it made his actions seem more realistic. And in that show, they try to get to kind of some real things that happened during the pandemic lockdown. So it was interesting to see a movie about the pandemic while we're still in the pandemic. So that vomiting was kind of a nitty-gritty detail that if you were trying to overly romanticize something, you'd probably leave it out, right? So realism is going to bring in kind of icky stuff that you may not necessarily want to see. That's why it puts the warning, right? We watched Bridgerton. Anybody seen the Netflix series Bridgerton? So it's like Jane Austen but with sex. So it's not really Jane Austen at all. But the warning said nudity, sexuality, violence, and smoking. Smoking was just in case you're traumatized by smoking, there's going to be some cigarettes. It's kind of, I thought of all those others, smoking seems kind of light, but those warnings let us know some of the realistic stuff that's going to be in there, right? If you have a 9-year-old in the room, they made all of it. What else makes a movie realistic?
You should also talk about possible scenarios. So you're not going to see like talking animals.
Oh, so
You have some movies like
some
that.
movies have like fantastical elements to it, right? So a realistic movie is only going to show you what really can happen, right?
You ever see a movie where somebody shooting a gun and it's like it never runs out of bullets?
Yeah.
You know?
Yes. Only shows, like, for example, any good James Bond movie, and I like me some James Bond, but that's really unrealistic, right? Any Tom Cruise movie, just generally speaking, probably not very realistic. Tom Cruise, even though he supposedly did all of his own stunts, or some of his stunts in this upcoming movie, like, did he really? I don't really like Tom Cruise very much, I'll tell anybody. So it only shows what really could happen, right? And if a movie is pretending to be realistic, like mostly realistic, and then it has a gun that never runs out of bullets, you go, wait a minute, I don't really trust this movie anymore, right? Sometimes if a movie is trying for realism and then it has an issue with it, it throws you completely out of the movie. You cannot, in some movies you're supposed to be able to suspend disbelief. So that if something like that happens, you can suspend the lack of realism for that moment and not ruin the movie. But if a movie's trying to be realistic and it has something like that that you don't think would really happen, you're like, okay, this is not a very good movie. Sometimes realism will take you to some, the endings, and this may be what you were also getting at, the endings of realistic movies are not always happy.
Have you ever seen Fury?
Mm-mm.
That's when it's not realistic, that's a good example.
They're not always happy.
No, it wouldn't happen.
Now, I like a good romantic comedy where you know that the main character, Amy Adams, is going to end up with what's his name, Patrick Marsden in that's the Cinderella one thing. You know they're going to end up together, even though they have a little fight or something bad happens. You know they're going to end up together, and at the end, or everybody's singing a song at a wedding. You know, that marriage plot is a Jane Austen plot. But realistic movies may not always be happy. During the pandemic, I've been inclined to watch feel-good movies, but I go into them knowing that they're not really realistic. Like, in the lockdown movie, spoiler alert, they steal a diamond, this couple does. So for all of the vomiting realism, I don't really think that they're going to be able to get away with stealing a huge diamond from Harrods in London. Like that didn't seem realistic. Part of it seemed realistic, but then the plot of it was like, I don't think so. That's not particularly realistic. Anything else that y'all had now? Because these are all really good kind of terms in relation to realism we'll talk about in our literature. But anything else that is not covered up here that you all jotted down?
I feel like the character should have some flaws, but nothing that absolutely destroys them. Like their flaws shouldn't turn into a material.
So characters should not be all good or all bad. How's that? Even Tom Hanks can have some flaws. Like even Mr. Rogers might have a flaw. And even the most unredeemable person might have a good characteristic. Because there probably are some purely evil people and there probably are some purely good people, but generally speaking, most of us are a mix of these. So characters probably are a realistic character is going to have a little bit of this and a little bit of that. It's not going to be all one way or another. A lot of times in film, one of the kind of ways people think about screenplays is to have characters who are all mostly bad or mostly good as a way to kind of build the film. And we kind of expect it. Like sometimes, you know, it used to be in the Westerns, if somebody was wearing a white hat, you knew they were going to be like the heroic person. They were like the symbols in movies. But generally speaking, most humans, most real people, are not all good or all bad. One thing that y'all haven't mentioned is like language. People usually talk like real people. And some of this has to do with acting, right? Being able to inhabit a character. But like if you're talking, if a film is set in New Orleans, you're gonna have somebody that's gonna have a southern accent, right? If your film is set in London, they're gonna have a British accent. If the film is set in Zimbabwe, the characters will maybe have a Zimbabwean. An interesting thing is sometimes French characters speaking English with a French accent, and you know they're actually French, so why are they speaking? You have to, that's a moment of suspending disbelief. But generally speaking, people talk like real people. if you're writing about a certain region, and that person is from that region, that person will likely have an accent of some sort. So, dialect is part of a character, is part of character building. And what you don't want to do, you know, to be realistic, you don't want to be stereotypical. Just because somebody is from New Orleans doesn't mean they have to have the same accent, right? But people all, depending on where they're from, or if they're from a city versus from the country, if they're from the West Coast versus the East Coast, all these different factors will play into how they talk. And that should be referenced in movies. A realistic movie should do that. So these are all characteristics. If we move over to this board, realism and naturalism, which we'll cover at the end of the class, more so than right now. Naturalism is kind of realism squared. If you think about transcendentalism, it's like romanticism squared. Naturalism is like realism squared. You wouldn't have naturalism if you didn't have realism. So I'm going to talk about realism more in more detail because naturalism kind of follows off of realism. And these are some key terms and some key things we'll look at this semester in relation to some of these texts. So, do you all know this word verisimilitude? It's kind of a cool word. If you don't know it, use it to impress your friends later today. But verisimilitude is the ability of seeming real. Just a fancy way of saying that. So if you're in a creative writing class and somebody has said, you need to adopt a little bit more verisimilitude with that. It means you need to sound a little bit realer and a little bit less like a story. Like to be truly real, you shouldn't sound like a story. That makes sense. Like, when I was in graduate school, I had to go and observe all of the new graduate students when they were teaching, and had to give them feedback on their teaching. And it was really a cool opportunity to watch a whole bunch of really nervous people teach composition. And I had been teaching for a longer time, so I had some authority to give them feedback. And one of the guys who was teaching, he came in and he said, "Good morning, class. Welcome to English 101. How are you today?" And I said, "Man, that guy's full of it. Why is he talking that way?" Like, I could not, almost a cross between a vampire and some sort of Harvard professor, kind of a fake Harvard. The whole class, he kept this tone up. "Hello, Avi, how are you today? It's nice to see you. Good day." I mean, it's crazy. I almost laughed. I was sitting in the back going, this guy cannot teach. What is wrong with him? So I didn't know how to phrase it. I didn't know how to tell him. It was my responsibility to tell him that his tone was kind of weird. Like it felt like he was a fake teacher or trying to imagine himself as a teacher. So I went to see him in his office and I said, "Philip," and he goes, "Yes, how are you today?" And I said, "Oh my God, that's how he talks. He's fake all the time. He's not a real person." And I never heard him speak in a normal way. He always sounded like this. "Hello." When he was having dinner, I guess he would. I mean, it had to be, I don't know how it could be real. I guess it had to be partially real. And then I said, never mind. I don't know what to tell you because it's just too much. He has gone on to have a successful career in academia, but I suspect he still talks this way. Now, could you just do y'all know any, first of all, do y'all know any teachers that teach that way? Okay. I'm sorry. But it doesn't, to me, that is not seeming real. That's like you trying to not seem real, trying to act like you are a teacher. when you're not a teacher. Maybe he started out doing that when he first started teaching, and then he couldn't stop himself. Like they say Madonna, when she was living in England, she adopted a British accent and she couldn't stop it. So maybe he started out having a fake teacher voice and then he couldn't stop himself. Best I can tell.
Do you think that if you moved to another place, you would develop another?
Well,
My granddad's from Lithuania, and he can't tell.
you can't tell that he's from Lithuania?
He's been here like 50 years.
Yeah.
He can still sort of speak it, he said he forgot a lot of it.
But his accent's not.
He's got an American accent, he's still got just a little bit of,
Yeah. It's interesting how dialect clings to you. Like, I come from Kentucky. Grew up in Western Kentucky. Neither of my parents went to high school. So I grew up in what you would call an uneducated household. Nobody read to me. I went to school, of course, and I had mentors in school, but my parents did not use the word verisimilitude regularly, during the day. So my son used to say that whenever I would talk to my dad on the phone, he said, "You've been talking to Papa, haven't you?" And I go, "Oh my gosh." He goes, "That's how you sound after you talk to Papa." He said, "You sound like you're right back there in Kentucky." And I go, I don't even know I'm doing it. But when I talked to my dad on the phone, I reverted back to my childhood dialect. And I didn't even know I was doing it. My daughter-in-law is Turkish, and her English is really good, but you can hear the Turkish in her, the way she does her R's. So I think you can train yourself away from your dialect, but I think some people, like my college roommate was from Southern Indiana, which is about like Kentucky. She wasn't really from the north, really. But her fiance was from Chicago, which is absolutely the north. And she started sounding like him. And I said, "Where are you getting that from? That's not Indiana." And she goes, "It must be from being around him." And she kept it because they ended up getting married. And so that's the voice she heard a lot, so she kept that sound. She never went back to the way she was before she dated him. So it's interesting how I think some people can drop it and train themselves to drop it, and some people, it's really easy for them to pick up somebody else's accent.
Well, what I've noticed is like if we're just sitting here talking, like I said, you couldn't tell, but if he were to get like irritated, kind of mad, you can definitely tell that he's not from South Carolina.
Well, it is. I wonder if emotions. I think emotions probably bring out dialect. It'll be interesting when we read Huck Finn, and some of these early stories that we read are going to have a lot of dialect in them. So when you read dialect, it makes the person sound more like a real person. But on the other hand, it can also, I think when people's emotions get up, I think they revert to what they know, maybe. So sometimes the language piece, and I use that here as behavior, sometimes the language piece is what helps add the verisimilitude. Like if you are, like I've got some really, really bad fake accents that I may use them at some point. I don't even know I'm doing it, but my son had a friend who was from Bulgaria. And he said, "When you meet him, I don't want you to make fun of his accent." And I said, "Well, why would I make fun of his accent?" He goes, "Don't make fun of his accent." I'm not rude. Why would I make fun of his accent? But when we met him, he goes, "Hello, Mrs. Flanagan. My name is Dimitri." And I go, "He sounds like Dracula." And I almost started laughing. And I go, "Oh my God, Wickham knew that I would laugh at the Dracula accent." And I go, "How can you be around him without laughing, Wickham?" He goes, That's just his accent, Mom. He's not pretending to be Dracula. He's just from Bulgaria." And I go, "I know that. I hadn't even thought about it being funny."
Is that like, it used to be like a Soviet place or something? 'Cause that
Bulgaria borders Turkey on the north, and it's next to Romania. And so Budapest and Bucharest are where Dracula was supposed to be from.
Yeah.
So it's kind of in the
Well, Dimitri, that's like. Russian.
Dmitri is a Russian name, yeah, but this guy's Bulgarian. A lot of the people in that area have, like even Turkey borders the Black Sea, which also borders Russia. So there's a Russian influence around the Black Sea. More information than you all probably wanted to know about Bulgaria. But it's funny how an accent can also make you think of something that's completely different from where you're supposed to be. Like that was that situation. We're going to be reading a lot of dialect. That is a characteristic of realistic fiction. We'll see it. It won't fade away, but as we get to high realism and naturalism, but with the local color writing, which is a form of regionalism. But local color writing was writing that was, local color simply means it is writing that has a distinctive flavor of an area. So color here just means the flavor of an area. So if there was something unique about the Bishopville area, and somebody wanted to write exclusively about Bishopville, that would be a local color story if you're just writing about Bishopville and what happens in Bishopville. Nobody from Bishopville here. I usually have somebody from Bishopville or Hartsville, the Hartsville local color. We're going to be, particularly post-Civil War, there's a lot of writing about areas that nobody really knew anything about. So you're going to have people writing about New Orleans, you're going to have people writing about Mississippi, you're going to have people writing about Montana, California, places where nobody else had really been before, Maine, these areas that were kind of opened up after the Civil War. People suddenly decided they had something to say. So local color writing is a feature of realism because it tries to capture the color of a region. And by color I mean the language, dialect, the manners, the way people behave, the rituals of certain areas. Like, it's interesting, funeral and wedding rituals are really very different depending on where you're from. Like, when I first came to South Carolina and somebody in the department, their parents died or something, and we were trying to figure out what to do, and I go, well, in my hometown, you'd send food over, and you would do, there's 17 different things that you would do, and they're like, oh no, you don't do that here, and I go, what do you do here? And I'm like, how can it be different? How is South Carolina different from Kentucky? But the funeral rituals were different. You have to kind of learn what they are. Wedding rituals can be different. Dating rituals can be different. Food, the things people eat are different. Like this word. This is a fish. And how do you say that?
Crappie. Some people say crappie.
Crappie or crappie? Crappie? You say crappie? That is a regionalism. In Kentucky, that's crappie. I always thought it was a really fancy fish. It sounded French. And then I came down here and people called it crappie. And I'm like, well, that's not very fancy. That's not a fancy fish. This word.
Like crawfish. You know, like crawfish, like crayfish, crawfish.
Crayfish, yeah, I've heard crayfish too. Crawdads. We call them crawdads. Like this word. Pecan. 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 I thought people in South Carolina were crazy to call it pecan until a guy that I worked with had a PhD in English, and he said, do you want some of these pecans? I'm like, wait a minute, is it pecan? Because I always thought pecan again sounded sort of French. For some reason, every word in Kentucky sounded vaguely French to me. But these two words are big different, the pronunciations are very different from here than they are in Kentucky. And I would have thought Kentucky and South Carolina would have been similar. But the language, the dialects, this would be a pronunciation and idiom. An idiom is usually like a turn of phrase, like, let me give you an example. Like my mother, if you ask my mother how things were going, and they were the same as they always were, she would say the same old 6 and 7. I have no idea what that means. And I'd ask, she didn't know what it meant either. She said, everybody always said that to her. And I said, the same old 6 and 7. Like, I don't know how that means. Everything's kind of boring.
It lines up the way it usually, 6 usually before 7 already.
I don't know. Well, 6 does come before 7, always. So, but that was an idiom unique to my mother. My daddy would always say things were as slick as glass. Everything. Roads were slick as glass. Ice was on it. Everything slick as glass. That was a term he always used. That particular simile. So you're going to see this come up in our writing too. Different areas of the country are going to have different idioms. And those idioms become unique to the area and tell us about the area things that we wouldn't know otherwise. And the more these are included, the more likely it is to represent the area uniquely in a real way. So all of these things are going to take us to verisimilitude. The detail that we get, the very specific things, and y'all mentioned this in relation to movies. If the way the water is running is correctly. One of the things that Mark Twain always had a beef with the Romanticists, because he said the Romanticists always placed rivers and things where they wanted them to rather than where they were. And he thought you needed to be honest about the detail. The detail needs to be right if it's going to be a realistic piece. So even though Twain is a realist, he's very different than somebody like James, but they're both realists in different ways. So the range of the realist writers is going to be pretty vast. Pragmatic simply means practical. And it doesn't mean that the writing is practical always, but it does mean that the writing and the details are purposeful. They're not done in such a way to exaggerate or to make things better than they are, that they're done to be purposeful. Who tells the story and how they tell the story gives you a different value about realism. So, point of view, I'll refer to that as POV a lot. But when we read Huck Finn, for example, it's going to be first person vernacular, which means we're going to hear it from Huck's mouth. And we'll talk about whether that makes him a reliable narrator or an unreliable narrator. Sometimes if you hear it from one person, it makes the story more unreliable, depending on how reliable the person telling the story is, right? But a lot of the realist writers are going to play around with point of view to try to find a way to tell a story that makes it the most realistic. How can we tell a story? How can we make this story seem the most realistic that it can be? Who should be telling it to allow us to understand it the best? And how can we accomplish that? So we'll see people playing around with point of view. It was Henry James that said point of view is the key feature of writing. That's the biggest decision that a writer has to make, is who tells the story. So if you fancy yourself a creative writer, thinking about who tells the story sometimes can be the biggest decision of that text. So when you read anything, particularly in this class, think about who is telling the story and how that changes what we know about what's going on in the story. When we read the Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County for Monday, that's a story within a story within a story. And so who's telling it has a lot to do with how true it is. So pay attention to who tells the story in that. Objectivity, the idea of trying to get to something objective. Now this is not the same thing as scientific objectivity, which the 18th century wanted. This is more about trying to step out of a situation or observe something so clearly that you can learn from it. The realists were firm believers in observing as a way of learning. So you're not looking for empirical evidence exactly, but you are observing how somebody else behaves in order to teach you about how you should behave. So sometimes in a novel like William D. Howe's novel, The Rise of Silas Lapham, Silas Lapham is a merchant who ends up earning, we're not reading this, it's not a spoiler alert exactly, but if you want to read it, this is a spoiler alert. He ends up through sometimes kind of maybe not the best morally or ethical deals. He ends up being successful, but then there's this big fire where he loses everything. And one of the, so I've just spoiled the whole thing, but one of the messages of that, I think, is that you need to behave, perhaps the seeds of his defeat are somehow tied to the manner in which he put all of his eggs in one basket, so to speak. So we learn by being objective, by watching what people do, we can learn to practice some of those more positive behaviors ourselves. We can learn from somebody else's mistakes. So that's a good reason to let people make mistakes in the story. So in Huck Finn, we're going to see a lot of people punished. People are going to be dying in different episodes. That's more realistic than everybody ending up happy at the end of these episodes, probably. And one of the things I think Twain would want us to do is, what do we learn from that? What do we learn from watching this scene of the king and the duke? That's the story within the story. But there's a moral to that to some degree that Huck can learn if he wants to apply it. So that's one of the benefits or one of the rationales for having things play out more realistically instead of romantically, is so that you as an observer can learn from these other people's actions. So the more realistic a story is, the more realistic a movie is, right? The more lessons we have for ourselves. If I only watched movies where the main female married the most handsome man in the movie, if I watched 100 movies like that, I'd be desperately sad to know that was not going to happen to me, right? But I've watched enough realistic movies to know that that's a fairy tale, right? Generally speaking, that's a fairy tale. So realism allows us to see and put our attentions more on what is actually going to happen to give us lessons about behavior, I guess. So you're going to see some attempts at objectivity, and you're going to see some things play out sometimes into a bad end, but all of those are this kind of desire to learn from observing. Language, manners, rituals, these are all things that we'll watch. And some of that is because these three fields of study became popular in the late 19th century. Anthropology, which is the study of kind of ancient humans, sort of rituals and methods of behavior. And Edith Wharton will use anthropology, apply anthropological principles to New York society. Psychology, of course, you probably all know about Freud, and all know about a lot of the psychology is becoming popular during this time. Freudian stuff is going to be towards the end of the century. So you're gonna see people writing about things they've never written about. William Dean Howells wrote about divorce for the first time. Divorce was a thing that happened in society, but nobody had really ever written about divorce. We're gonna read 2 stories by Kate Chopin that are really about adultery. That was not necessarily written about as a positive thing, that adultery can be something that could be okay. Not that I think Kate Chopin necessarily believed it would be okay for everybody, but in this particular situation, maybe it was okay this one time. So psychology, how people think and how thinking affects what people do, like that whole idea was coming into the foreground. And then sociology, which is the study of how groups operate. So these new sciences or social sciences are affecting the writers and how people are also reading text. How am I doing for time? I'm about out of time. I'll cover some of these things again on Monday, or I maybe go into them a little bit deeper. This end of the 1800s, from the Civil War until the turn of the century, so much happening, so many cultural, economic, political, every kind of change was happening. So I'm just going to list them, and I'll probably go into more detail later. Industrial Revolution, post-Civil War, Industrial Revolution ramps up in the Northeast. You're going to start seeing more industry in the South, particularly in Alabama. Birmingham, Atlanta, you're going to get some, Georgia and Alabama are going to get some more industry. And that Industrial Revolution, it needs people to run it. And the answer comes with immigration. So this is a huge, huge influx of immigrants. And America has always been a country of immigration since its beginning, but this is one of the biggest influxes of immigration is post-Civil War. You've got Jewish people from Eastern Europe, you've got German, you've got the Irish, you've got the Italian, you've got African Americans moving from the Deep South into industrial centers in the North, like Chicago and New York City. And that's, in a sense, is a kind of immigration. And all of these people are competing for the same jobs. And most of these are crappy factory jobs. And when I say crappy factory jobs, I mean crappy factory jobs. It means that you could get your finger lopped off. It's kind of a gross image. During the course of a day's work, you could get your finger lopped off. You could have 16 people living in 2 rooms in a tenement where you shared an outhouse with another family, and you had to throw your slop water out in the streets. So there was no labor unions. Little kids were working. Little kids sometimes were sold as prostitutes to it was awful to be packed into these cities like sardines and kind of forced into this industrial work because that's the only jobs that were available when you didn't speak English very well. You were taken advantage of by these people. And then there was a lot, particularly in the urban areas, you're going to have a lot of gang activity. So you would have the Italian gang, you would have the German gang, you would have...
A lot of gangs tend to be in urban areas like that.
I think it's because of the immigration. Kids in New York, if you go to New York City right now, well, maybe not right now. I wanted to write on that board really badly right then, but I didn't do it. So if I ever go towards this board with the Sharpie out, say, Dr. Flanagan, stop. Think about it. You're ruining something. So I almost did it just then. So like New York I'm not a good artist. Many of you have been in my classes and you know this looks a little bit like Florida, or I don't know what it looks like, but this is Manhattan. And so there's a river here, water here, for all intents and purposes. The Lower East Side, so this is east, so the Lower East Side, which is not that big in real life, is layered with that certain areas where different immigrant populations came to. So still today, there's Chinatown. It's called Chinatown. There's Little Italy. I don't know, I'm not probably linking them here very well. There's German, I don't think it's called Germantown, but the Jewish area had a name too. So whenever people came into Ellis Island, which is in this basic area, they would go to where they knew people were that spoke their language. Sometimes relatives that came before them and sent for them, and they would all live in the kind of the same basic area. So if you owned a factory, let's say it was right here, and you needed 200 people to do a shift, and you knew somebody who lived in Little Italy, you might just come down and say, find me 150 people, and I've got a job for the week if they need it. And so, if you were an Irish person, and you knew that this person was using only Italians, you're gonna get pissed off at the Italians, and you're gonna try to figure out a way to get those jobs. So gangs became a way to create a kind of power group to work against another group that had more power in economic terms. There also became drugs became involved pretty early. It was cocaine, I think, in the late 18th century. But a lot of it had to do with the fact that the immigrants came to urban areas first, because that's where the jobs were.
I imagine that, like, the lack of education, because all these kids were in factories.
And they weren't in school, and they didn't know English very well. And if you had African Americans moving from the deep South, most of them had been kept illiterate for so long that you had factory work was seen as kind of a golden opportunity, really. You didn't need to be literate. You didn't need to have necessarily a skill set. Age didn't matter. Ethnicity didn't matter. And you made a wage, right? And you were in America, right? Where you could potentially, the next generation, one of the dreams of the immigrant experience is that the next generation is not going to have to work the way that generation had to. So it was just really, really, really hard. It was a hard life in Manhattan, in any urban area, if you were an immigrant or if you were arriving from a place unfamiliar with the setup. The police force were mostly corrupt, all taking bribes from everybody. That's a generalization, I shouldn't say that. But there was a lot of corruption, and if you had money to pay somebody off, you could get away with all kinds of stuff. So if you had your hand cut, now moving up to a hand cut off in a factory accident, there was nothing you could do. You may not ever be able to work again in your life, but there was no recourse. You couldn't sue anybody. You just stayed at home and sent your 12-year-old.
When did unions come out?
Unions were towards the end of the century. But early 20th century, you're going to have the AFL-CIO formed to try to put some protections on people. That's going to go against child labor. That's kind of basic safety. But a lot of that is fomented during this time, but hasn't really happened yet. Same thing is true for just sanitary conditions. So much unsanitary stuff. Just like if you imagine two families sharing an outhouse in Manhattan with 15 people living in 3 rooms, and a lot of these would be extended families that had a lot of people, like the Irish coming over from Ireland, they were fleeing worse poverty because of the potato famine. So America seemed like this really great land of possibility just because there was a job, right? But the jobs were crappy. So before the Civil War, urbanization had mostly been in the Northeast, but there hadn't been a lot of it. Most of the U.S. was still rural. After the Civil War, that changed. So you had these big urban areas, and New York became one of the key ones because of the immigration situation, and because there were a lot of monopolies that were formed. I'm also not the best speller. So you had people who were making a lot of money off the steel industry because they were the only people doing it. You had a lot of people making a lot of money off the oil industry because there's only one person who did the oil. So all these monopolies had the raw materials for the Industrial Revolution, and they were just making shit tons of money. And then you had all, I'm completely out of time. And then you had all of these immigrants working for nothing. So you can see where the haves and the have-nots. And the economy was very, very rocky. There'd be a lot of money available, and then 5 years later there'd be a depression. And then there'd be a lot of money available, and then there'd be a depression. So you never knew if it was going to be feast or famine. There was no protections on banks. You know, this is before the Great Depression and before we had bank holdings were insured. So you can have a bunch of money in the bank, Avi, and then there'd be a big sellout, and you would lose all your money through no fault of your own. Now that would be annoying. Mark Twain put a whole bunch of money into this really crazy invention, and he lost it. He was bitter. We'll talk about that when we talk about Twain. He was really bitter about losing all his money. He had to do this big tour to raise money to pay off his debts. So it was bust and boom, just like the gold rush, which was also taking place. We had a lot of technological advances, telegraph, photographs. Photographs were really first photographs, really during the Civil War, but then photography became kind of a way to kind of capture something realistically. Transportation changes. We got the railroad, which becomes very, very important in fueling urbanization and then industrial revolution, and even immigrants can move farther inward. A lot of the racial and gender inequities become more pronounced, and the failures of Reconstruction, particularly with voter suppression and Jim Crow laws, and huge economic depression in the South post-Civil War, and then just generally economic uncertainty. Put all these things into a bottle and shake them up, and you've got a lot of anxious people. And they really believed that people needed to see the real thing and not some rose-colored glasses image of the world. That we really needed to see real America, not something fake, not something unrealistic. So for Monday, I've changed the reading list. I sent you the new reading list. I just had a couple of dates mixed up. So, and I gave you the right one when you were in my office the other day. So there's 2 stories to read for Monday, which are the Celebrated Jumping Frogs, Calaveras County, which is one of Mark Twain's early stories, and The Love of Roy Camp, which is an early story by Bret Harte. Both of these are stories that take place in the West, and I'll talk a little bit about the West, which is an interesting part of our big continent. Our North America, the United States is getting bigger during this time too, largely because of the railroad. Something to do with the gold rush, the idea that there was a place where you could go and kind of disappear. If you didn't like the way that your life was going in Kentucky, you could go to California and change your name and nobody would ever know that you were actually married, or that you'd killed a man, or that you owed $2 million. Like, you could just go and set up a new identity. There was no identification card that you had, there was no birth certificate required. You could just go and say, my name is Georgia Fraley. Hello. And they go, well, hi, Georgia. How are you? You have to remember your new name. I'm an Avon lady from Vermont. I don't really sound like Vermont. And then you can start your new life. Really hard to do that now, to start a new life like that. So we're going to see a lot of people recreating themselves because they can. So have a good weekend. Turn in your little piece that you wrote about the realistic movies. That'll be your first daily grade. And we'll see you on Monday. Thank you. This fine. Right, you too. Yes, ma'am.
Immigrants in New York, could they just move up?
Well, probably some people did. The problem was that's what they knew, and they probably knew people. Like if you were from, let's say you're from Dublin, you're probably not coming to New York unless you know somebody there. You might not, but you probably know that there are other Irish people there. So when you land on Ellis Island, or when you land in New York, they'll identify you as Irish. Thank you. You'll be identified as Irish immediately. And they'll say, oh, you need to go to, Decatur Street, or whatever. That's where the Irish all are. So you'd probably be kind of funneled there to some degree, or you may have an address of somebody that has a house or has a room. Like there's a really interesting movie called Brooklyn about an Irish immigrant. It's a little bit later in the, I think it's early 20th century, or even mid 20th century. But she comes over to stay with like a distant relative and work as like a maid because it's an opportunity for her to have a different life. Thank you. So they wouldn't necessarily know any place else to go. Now later on, if there had been, let's say you're the person that this factory owner goes to get the recruits, and if you keep supplying them, that person may move you up to a higher position, and you may move out into a different place, farther out. Because the goal of the immigrant, most of the time, was to make their children's experience better. So that might mean moving out of that area into another area and building the family. So the kind of classic story is the Godfather story of the Italians. There's a lot of that mafioso sort of talk started with the immigrant experience. Not that that's the only story, but it always interests me to know how much gang activity there was during this time period, and it was all tied to jobs and economic needs, which is, I think, the reason for gang activity now. Same reason.
It seems to me like a lot of people, like, if you're coming over from another, like, country or whatever, you would want to be around people with your own...
Who spoke your same language, who
You
understood.
have that community.
Yeah. So it would be hard. There were people that moved, like Chicago had some, because they were also industrialized. Chicago was because they were on a waterway. Any place that was on a waterway would have, like Louisville, Kentucky, because it was on the Ohio River, had one of the first cities in Kentucky because it was on the river. So any town that was on a river, New Orleans, although New Orleans really didn't have a lot of industry, but it had a lot of variety and diversity. And it treated its diversity a little bit more equal in some ways than, I guess, New York's is. It's interesting to be in the Lower East Side now because you can still see remnants of the way it was set up before. So, but, oh, and there's my